Yeah.
recording.
All right. I will keep it brief. Just want to introduce Jack Cohen, Professor Jack Cohen, Professor Emeritus of History. Though, of course, I don't really need to introduce Chuck, one of the living legends on campus. My former boss and my friend, so boss at the Luba Institute. As most of you know, the Luba Institute for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions ran on this paradigm of Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue. Chuck now had the time to put his ideas down and publish them with Oxford. He published the Abrahamic Religions in their very short introduction series, and his talk is based on his idea of braided histories. This is going to be the first talk of our now relaunched interdisciplinary religion group. The idea is that this becomes a place for graduate students and for faculty and staff where we can talk about religion, where we can talk about our own material, our own work, draw it out, test it, talk about methodology, maybe find time to read something together, who knows. I can see that Ben is here, who's going to present in a month. We have another one then planned for April, another meeting. But now Chuck kicks us off with the Abrahamic religions, and maybe it's appropriate for all of us to say hello and give him a big hand.
It's good to do it now because you may not want to when I'm done. Thank you, Willie, for the opportunity. I'm delighted that such a group is getting together, not necessarily that I'm at the butt end of it, but certainly I was always trying to extend the study of religion on campus, and so it's very nice to see a group of this nature convening, and I hope it continues. It's also great to see Catherine and John and David and Eric and people from my religious studies days. And, not quite the ghosts of Christmas past, I suppose, but people who have been very involved in their own ways in the study of religion on this campus. That's always something of, if not quite a struggle, an acquired taste. I've always felt that those of us, at least in many places on campus, have we do our thing in our quiet little way, and the bulk of the university goes on with around us and without us, and so it's again it's great to see some old friends and to acknowledge this group's existence. So what the book looks like is this. It's the product of industrial scholarship. Oxford says what the title is, what the cover is, what the font is, what the margins are, how many illustrations there are going to be, how many words there are going to be, and it's my job to fulfill that diktat. I envision the book as a framework and the basis of a conversation. That is, it's an effort to put together a narrative, a skeleton, if you will, and using a different metaphor, via which people can begin to talk about how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam might be understood and thought about in some kind of framework that does justice, I hope, to all of them. It is certainly not a unitary interpretation, nor can it possibly be a comprehensive overview. But again, it's intended to bring a certain kind of coherence, at least initially, to a conversation. And then if it proves to be incoherent, maybe a more coherent narrative will come out of it. But that's my thought. I think we're all familiar with a lot of treatments in comparative religion contexts that are thematic. I've come to this very much as a historian. And so historical narrative carries it. The core theme is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam constitute a family of religions in both a taxonomic and metaphoric senses. So this is a group I can use words like that with. I use the term Abrahamic. There are others, monotheists, people of the book, etc., etc. I think Abrahamic is the term that best articulates that insight. And I understand you've read the beginning, the end, and one chapter. So you have a little bit of my argument about why Abrahamic. And if there's time at the end, I'll tell you a story about why the epilogue is as short as it is. Again, the analytic mode is historical narratives, and this is something that allows me to bring in one of what I think are my most important interpretive tropes, that their relationships have been shaped by contingency, and particularly in my telling of things, politics. I'm not going to argue that politics is always the most important influence on these traditions, but I think it was a way to help tell the story, and I think that politics is an important thing to keep bringing up. Throughout the book, I've wanted to exhibit the dynamic tension both within the traditions and between the traditions, to emphasize, or at least to display, both the similarities and differences, and not to smooth over either of those. What I've tried to accomplish as well has been, first of all, to try to note interactions between the traditions, and allow a reader to view the development of each as it occurs in the context of the others. So again, this is a book designed for general audiences, the first book that one might read on this, certainly not the last. And I want to break people of the habit. I'm sure everyone here is already broken of that, but I want to break people in general of the habit of thinking of one or the other tradition. If I've done my work, a reader will come away from this and never again think just about Christianity without asking a question. So what's happening among Muslims and Jews at that time? If I can elicit that sort of response, or if I can instill that stimulus, I feel I will have done my work. So the book divides, I think, into two sections. The first 4 chapters, the last 3. The first 4 are what I might call origin stories, sort of get all the players on the ground while trying to develop some interactions between them. So chapter 1 deals with what I call, and what others have called, the Jewish matrix, the discovery of one God, the slow accretion of scriptures into what Jews call the Tanakh, the Jewish diaspora, and beginning the political theme, the impact of imperial conflicts. I bring up another point that I'm always trying to hit at, which is that these traditions are not static. There is no Judaism. There are Judaisms, there are Christianities, there are Islams. I have an ulterior motive for this, which I'll come to towards the end. It's something I suspect you all share with me. But in our common discourse, it's so easy to say Muslims believe or Jews believe, and so everyone gets lumped into one unity, and we know that's not true, and so I'm constantly beating readers over the head with that. So by the time of the Second Temple, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, are proclaiming a universal God while claiming to have a particular role in way in which they interact with their God. And in so doing, they supply building blocks for Christianity and Islam. The second chapter introduces the reader to Christianity, which I try to show is product of both this Jewish matrix and of Greco-Roman culture. The New Testament, after all, is written in Greek. The genres it takes are borrowed from Greek sources rather than from Hebrew literature. And Christians begin to formalize their identity, claiming that they are the new Israel, but that they are neither Jews nor Greeks nor pagans. And so I try to explain quickly what that involves. And the chapter runs through the 2nd century, in which that identity, which is still in the process of being formed, is starting to be embedded in theology, in ritual, and in an ecclesiastical structure. The 3rd chapter is the most schizoid to write, at least in terms of subject matter. It deals with rabbinic Judaism, the politics of the Roman Empire, religion in Byzantium, early Jewish-Christian relationships, and the great Christological and Trinitarian controversies. So try putting that in one chapter of about 15 pages. All of those things I think are necessary in order to put each of those things in context with the other. I do try to emphasize at least a couple of things, and going through this theme of saying that what happens in Judaism and Christianity and eventually Islam are happening to them at the same time, and trying to, again, give a reader a sense of those parallel tracks. So I talk about the impact of the destruction of the Second Temple that necessitates a refiguration of Judaism on a scale that I think neither Christians nor Muslims have themselves ever faced. Meanwhile, while Jews are reconstructing their traditions into rabbinic Judaism, Christians are sorting through the complex theological questions about the nature of God and of Christ. Those debates occasion strains among churches that politics, both ecclesiastical and imperial, only exacerbate. And these relationships don't occur in a vacuum. Both sides are, as it were, looking over their shoulders a little bit as they formulate their canons, and sort of knowing that they're formulating identities now against a potential rival, or at least another powerful religious other, plays a part in the ways in which these traditions develop themselves. These dynamics are only complicated in chapter 4 by the emergence of Islam within its own political and cultural matrix. The Quran reflects an inspiration that is both received in part, but is also very much its own unique thing. I'm at pains to show the intimate relationship between Islam and state power from the outset, which is certainly different from what Christians experience. Muhammad, as you well know, was the head of an incipient state as well as a prophet, and Islam spread initially alongside the imperial expansion, or the expansion of the Arab Empire. So throughout, again, I'm trying to emphasize variations within traditions in these chapters, talking about Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, talking about the Sunni-Shia split, which I see as primarily political, at least initially, becoming a more religious division as time goes on. So chapters 5 through 7 might be said to deal more with relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims from the 7th century to the present. Chapter 5 deals with the medieval interactions after some very brief, even in a brief volume, discussion of Islamic law and theology. I turn towards the Crusades, noting that on the Christian side, first of all, it appropriates an ideology of holy war to advance various Christian interests, and that those interests are not always against Muslims. That's what most people will know, of course, and the Crusades begin against Muslims. But again, as I'm sure this group well knows, there are crusades against Christians, there are crusades against pagans. There aren't crusades against Jews per se, but Jews wind up being collateral damage in these affairs as well. And I talk about the Muslim side. First, the sort of confused politics that allows the Franks, if you will, to gain a foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then the elaboration of jihad ideology as a way of fomenting a resistance to the Crusades, which takes a little bit of time to get going. It does begin to pick up steam and is ultimately successful. So from an Islamic point of view, at the end of at least the 13th century, the Franks have been entirely routed. One of the more immediate impacts of the Crusades for Muslims is a raised importance of Jerusalem as a holy site. There is a longer-term memory that really doesn't kick in until the 19th century, when Muslims are once again, in many places, are once again finding themselves under Western pressures, under colonialism, under imperialism. And that's a view of the perfidiousness of the Christian West. And of course, that rhetoric we can see today as coming from various groups. And again, it goes back to a certain political moment hundreds of years before that's very meaningful for the people who are uttering it, because it is part of their collective memory. But I also talk about how Christian and Muslim polities treat their religious minorities. It's not always blood and guts or putting people to the sword. As a very gross generalization, I'll say that Muslims tended to treat their Jews and Christians better than Christians tended to treat their Muslims and Jews, although there are many counterexamples to that. And again, I try to spell out what the terms of those arrangements were, and again, some of the factors that lead to certain kinds of things happening in certain circumstances. There are many instances of cultural exchange, the most familiar of which is in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Iberia, and its surroundings for a number of centuries. I contest the view that Al-Andalus is a golden age, or at least a kind of perfect sphere in which there was little tension and everyone got along. Not exactly. The Risorgimento was always going on in the background. But that said, the term golden age at least captures a certain sense of shared intellectual and cultural excitement, for which one can find many examples. And so again, I'm trying to use this as a way of saying there isn't any standard way in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians interact, there are ways that are contingent on all sorts of different factors. The sixth chapter deals with reform, and Dan, who was my TA in 1 year of this course, of the course that bedrocks the book, will probably remember it. I remember it as being maybe the weakest part of the course. I think through some kind of awkward transmogrification, it's become one of the stronger parts, or at least one of the parts that interests me. So I'm dealing here with modernization without using the term modernization, which I think would sink me and anyone else trying to fathom it. What I'm trying to do is to talk about how each tradition tries to adapt to certain things which collectively at least encompass some of what we call modernity. So the global expansion of Christian empires from Europe, the rise of skepticism, the emergence of nation states as a primary political form over empires. And so just to give you some little sense of what I'm trying to do in this chapter, as I see it, Christianity undergoes the Reform, the Reformation, or Reformations, there are plural of them, that challenges the constituted authority of the Catholic Church with the claim of returning to, at least from a Protestant view, the pristine apostolic church. And one of the end results is, of course, the fragmentation of Christian identity even more. The effort to unify the church ends up doing precisely the opposite. I also then talk about the Enlightenment, and particularly the religious Enlightenment that David Sorkin, a colleague of mine and some of ours here now at Yale, really wrote the book on that. And the religious Enlightenment tries to bring revelation in line with reason. In Islam, reform employs concepts that date back to the 7th century, to the Quran, and then a little later to the Hadith, so that whereas Christianity doesn't have an innate or inbred vocabulary for reform, Islam does. And that vocabulary has some impact, obviously, on Islamic reform. Islamic reform often looks back to what Muslims imagine was the authentic earliest stage of the tradition and of communal interpretation, but the ways in which these movements, particularly as we get into the 18th and 19th century, play out, they play out in many different ways, depending on geography, depending on political conditions, depending on the degree of European intervention or perceived European intervention. So once again, I'm suggesting that politics, whether a movement, say, goes as the movement in the Sudan does, in a very violent revolutionary way, or whether it goes in a much more intellectual way, as Islamic modernism does in Egypt and elsewhere, has something to do with the Islamic tradition itself, but it also has something to do with where these movements are taking place and what people see, or who people see as their perceived enemies. For Judaism, reform in Judaism coincides with the Enlightenment and emancipation. And so Jews, at least some Jews, start to rethink their religious law using reason, and very influential is the idea that if they get it right in some ways, they get into full citizenship. So, to put it in one way, whereas Muslims might view the Enlightenment as a poison pill because it's coming from dangerous sources, for some Jews the Enlightenment is liberation because it allows them to get out of the ghetto. Reform in Judaism doesn't look back in the way that it does, in my viewing of it, in the way that it does in much of Islam and in Protestant Christianity. But all of the traditions are wrestling with these kinds of issues. So again, there's no single answer. Finally, and I guess this may be the chapter that you read, I talk about modern encounters, about imperial expansion and migration continuing to shape religious geography. In other versions of this presentation, I have maps in which I can show that even in 1500, Christianity is, for all intents and purposes, a European tradition. Yes, there's Ethiopia, yes, there's southwestern India, but the real density, if you will, the population density is in Europe. Fast forward 500 years later, and essentially Christianity, Western Christianity, has outflanked Islam by taking over the Western Hemisphere and then going through Southern Africa into Australia and so on. That's an effort just to try to describe the changes that Western imperialism have brought in a Christian context. And I also try, whenever I can, to talk about Eastern Orthodoxy, and in this case, it's to say that Eastern Orthodoxy does not have that kind of political base, if you will. One of the things that impressed me, just for myself as I went about writing this, is what Philip Jenkins would call the lost history of Christianity, and what happens to the eastern portions of Christianity. If you think about what are the 5 most important sees in the early church, there's Rome, but that's far away. Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. And 3 of those get taken over by the Arabs in the 7th century, and they keep knocking on Constantinople's door for a long period of time. So just my own research impressed that fact upon me. For Muslims, as colonization and as imperialism begins to recede in different times and different places in the 20th centuries, Muslims have to reassert, want to reassert the Islamic nature of their polities, but they begin to do so in many ways. The caliphate may be a dream, and it may be the ideal to which one aspires, but the ways in which Muslims have constructed their states since the mid-20th century shows a great deal of variety, though maybe the impulse to Islamicize is fairly constant across those. Finally, for Jews, this is a period of major relocations. If in 1900, 80% of Jews live in Eastern Europe, and the rest have migrated into Sephardic Jewry, into Islamic lands, particularly the Ottoman Empire. As we sit here today, the 2 biggest poles of Jewish life are Israel and the United States. So in all this folk wandering, if you will, in some ways, Jews, Christians, and Muslims interact more now than they have, at least globally, in much of their history. The results of that, however, I would see as ambiguous. So here are the 3 major points that I want to collect out of this, and then I'll go to a conclusion. One is that I myself think of these histories, and I want readers to think of these histories as braided. For me, as a Jew, that takes the form of a challah, the bread that we have on the Sabbath. But more generically, it could be hawsers. It could be braided hair. That works. The point is that braids are unique strands that wrap around each other and so are in close proximity and may be said to form something greater than their parts, but the parts still remain distinct. So in the book, I'm always trying to do this, I think in the chapter, through the illustrations. In the chapter that you've read, I really wanted that one of Mustafa Ceric, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, and the Pope, in part because we brought Mustafa Ceric here in 2006. He was one of the first people the Institute brought in, and I later had the fortune to meet him again in Qatar at a conference. So I really wanted that picture. I thought it fit the chapter, and I paid for it too. That's a different story. But in other places, I'm trying to use the illustrations to upset the expectations. So in the chapter on Islam, when I get to the Quran, I have a Quran. So I'm talking to the editors in New York and saying, here's what I want for it. And they said, well, we have this picture of the Quran, which was a Quran in Arabic, and anybody can do that. I said, in fact, that's the one you used in Michael Cook's book on the Quran. What I want is what I got, finally, I'm happy to say, which was the Quran in an Ashkenazic dialect of Hebrew that was transcribed from a translation offered by a Jew who converted to Christianity and held a position at some Christian academy in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. And this volume, so the Quran is in Hebrew, and it is bound with a biography of Muhammad and an account of the night journey. And this is given to the Jewish community of Cochin in the middle of the 18th century as a way of at least knowing what their Muslim neighbors might have been about. So that's not the illustration of the Quran you expect. And that's the point. And then, returning the favor, when I have a picture of the Tanakh, it's one that's done in a Muslim country, so the page that's shown is a carpet page in which the person doing this is emulating Islamic designs. So this braiding, by the way, I wanted to call the book Braided Histories. The editor said, no, too poetic. It's going to be called The Abrahamic Religions, a very short introduction. So there you are. The second point is that politics matters. For instance, Christian and Muslim identities take shape in close contact with state power, particularly for Christianity. Once Constantine gets his hands on the entire empire, and then the church as well. I'll just mention the caliphate as indicative of that relationship within Islam. But Rabbinic Judaism develops in a different dynamic. Jews generally don't have a state, and so Rabbinic Judaism develops as it does without having, to take state power or its own state power into account. It's also something I bring up when I talk about the various reform movements. I've already suggested some of that, how Islamic reform is very much inflected by the political situations in which Muslims find themselves at any particular time. Sometimes the movements themselves are at least equally devoted to political resistance. Indeed, one purifies Islam for some of these movements through by throwing off an imperial oppressor. In other cases, that's not the course that it takes. I've mentioned also for Jews, reform occurs in a very different political context. And for Christians, the Reformations and the Enlightenment take place within Christian polities. So Christians they certainly argue among each other. And the state will get involved in these arguments, but they're Christian states. So that's a different dynamic than reform movements that take place in states where someone else, some other religion is governing. Finally, I want to say that chronology matters. Here I put my heart as a historian on my sleeve. Judaism frames the context in which Christianity appears, and then Judaism and Christianity similarly frame the context in which Islam appears. Now, I need to be very careful about what I'm saying. First of all, I am not making a theological or political claim. I would deny that chronological order has anything to do with truth. I am not saying that Judaism is superior because it comes first, or that either Christianity or Islam has superseded Judaism because they came later, though we can all think of people who make those claims. That's not the claim that I am making. Second, nor am I claiming that Christianity and Islam are reducible simply to variations of Judaism. Each has their own revelation and their own inspiration. What I am doing, I hope, is making a historical claim that Christian identity had to, or chose to, if you will, to take Judaism into account. The God whom Jesus is said to be the son of is the God of Israel. It's not some God pulled off the street or some other monotheistic deity. It's that God. And that then means that as Christianity develops its understanding of Jesus and that God, it has made the choice to do so within certain parameters, that this is the God of Israel. In a similar way, when Muhammad in the night journey goes to the farthest mosque, to Jerusalem, and claims to pray with Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and actually the whole line of prophets, he is putting himself into this prophetic tradition that is set up through, at least as he sees it, through Judaism and Christianity. That matters. One can at least imagine a prophet coming out of Arabia and claiming something very different. That's not what happened. That's the claim I'm making. Put another way, ancient Jewish identity was formed or forged, first of all, against polytheists, which is why the prophets are always yammering on in the way and excoriating this or that king for falling away, and of course all of Israel and Judah as well. Rabbinic Judaism was at least aware of Christianity. Christians and Muslims chose to inherit aspects of the extant Abrahamic religions. So finally, that term, Abrahamic religions, I see it as functioning in two ways. First, in the way that I use it throughout almost the entire book, is that it's an analytic category for understanding a group of religious traditions. One conclusion from this historical analysis, which I've already said a number of times and will bore you with again, there's no single Judaism, no single Christianity, no single Islam. Just by trying to introduce as many variants as I can within a short narrative and keep it comprehensible, I'm trying to give people the sense that, well, Christians have differed, and there are a lot of different kinds of them. And here's a little bit about them. So each varies internally, let alone externally. And also the ways in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims treat each other is not, in my view, predisposed by, let's say, theological necessity, but rather it's inflected by their historical context. I'm not saying that theology or religious politics aren't important. I am saying that I don't see them as predetermining the ways in which people behave towards each other. And so a corollary from this is that any characterization based on essentialist principles is, in my humble opinion, ill-conceived. Now, that statement has implications for a second meaning, and let me dilate on that a little bit. The term Abrahamic religions has been used, particularly recently, as a device to encourage better relationships among Jews, Muslims, and Christians based on their perceived affinities. I certainly have sympathy for this. It's one of the things that we try to do at the Lubar Institute. It and a wider scope of developing religious understanding underlay my trying to put religious studies together back in the day. But I have some caveats about the term and the enterprise. On the one hand, I think the term Abrahamic religions has some utility. It can mean a family of traditions, and the term, I think, can help qualify two ideological statements that are bandied about a lot in our current civil discourse and that I wish to undercut. One has to do with the Judeo-Christian ethic, which in a simple form says that Judaism and Christianity share common values. These values underwrite American politics and morals. Well, for most of their history, Jews and Christians would have been bemused, at least by the claim that they shared common values and traditions, when they were trying their level-headed best, sometimes bloodily, to get as far apart from each other and to separate their traditions from each other as they could. Just as an example, in the 2nd century, the Adversus Judaeos, the against the Jews rhetoric, begins to become prominent among some Christian thinkers at a time when, as has recently been pointed out, Jewish definitions of a goy, of what constitutes a foreigner, begin to be redeployed and the lines begin to harden. I do think that the idea of a Judeo-Christian ethic comes out of the mid-20th century, and I think it does have some very salutary effects. It has some useful work to do in demarginalizing Jews in this country and elsewhere. And so I applaud it for that, but let's not make this into a 2,000-year history. The other thing is that I would want to oppose the term Abrahamic religions to the idea of there being a clash of civilization, which in a simple form might be characterized as the statement that Islam is alien and inherently antagonistic to Western civilization, and in a more advanced form, that is to say, the Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, 1,000 years ago, Baghdad was one of the intellectual capitals of the universe, and what Muslim scholars were doing, aided in part by some Christian and Jewish scholars, was of course rescuing the heritage, the Greek and Roman heritage, which they then transferred to Cordoba and so on. In other words, well, we have Arabic numerals, or we use Arabic numerals, not Roman numerals. So if Islam is inherently alienated from Western civilization, how do we understand that history? Now, And one other point that really stunned me when I came across it is that some historians would say that because the Arab Empire was open for travel within it, because of trade routes, etc., that the teachings of Reform Judaism actually spread more quickly because than they might have otherwise if there had been many more political barriers to cross. So in the current political climate, I see much to recommend this sense of the Abrahamic religions if it might replace Judeo-Christian ethic as a cultural mean. But here's a caveat. Treating Jews, Christians, and Muslims as members of a metaphorical Abrahamic family, because they all look up to Abraham, they're members of a family and should therefore be nice to each other, and can be nice to each other, I think has some limits. The image is rooted in Abraham's hospitality as we get it from Genesis 18, where he welcomes the conveniently three strangers, angels, and by some interpretation, anyway, he welcomes them, and he has his servants cook them a nice meal, and so on. In other words, Jews, Christians, and Muslims should likewise shelter themselves under Abraham's welcoming and capacious tent. Now, I think there's some cogency to this, and some sharing. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam do share certain ethics. The Golden Rule can stand in for as a summary for that. In a different way, there are certain, can I use the word phenomenological? If I do, will I say it correctly? But certain religious experiences that I think can be said to be common among the traditions, particularly in unitive mysticism, where people in trying to present themselves directly to God, as getting as close to God as they possibly can, begin to divest themselves of whatever identities helped launch them into this territory. And I have I'd love to quote a passage from Rumi in this point, because it makes it makes the point so nicely. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Muslim. He throws someone else in there as well, and then he goes off into the language of mysticism. I am one with the infinite. So I think it is possible, paradoxically, Jews, Christians, and Muslims may sound the most similar in their devotions when they have divested themselves purposively, as much as they can, of being Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But I think that their grouping themselves around there being an Abrahamic family at least raises problems. One is that they understand themselves as children of Abraham in different ways. Jews as being really genetically descended. Christians as being adopted into the family. And Muslims less by genealogy, although there are genealogies that trace Muhammad back to Ismail, less by genealogy than by merit, if you will, by their claim to have recovered Abraham's own religion. Abraham, as the Quran tells us, being the first Muslim. The second thing is that when Jews, Christians, and Muslims array themselves as family clans, as Am Yisrael, as the body of Christ, as the Ummah, they all assert their own preeminence and their rights to Abraham's legacy over everyone else. The worst family feuds, I think, except on TV, are those in which children contest the inheritance. I'm beginning to see that work out in a friend of my wife's right now. That's when it gets really ugly. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are, in their own ways, each arguing that they are the worthiest heir, as it were, as I like to say, they're arguing over whom Dad loved best. So their braided futures, I think, are going to depend on how or whether they can test their perceived birthrights. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and I had to say that in 35,000 words in this, though a few fewer here. And I'm open to your comments, questions, and
Well, thank you, John.
critiques.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to behave like the Democrats' debate last night. So we can just dive in whenever appropriate and make sure that each one can finish.
The commentators had something to do with that, with the questions they asked, but yes, I expect this.
But
A little more civil.
So, but before we have a round of Q&A and the conversation about what you shared with us, I want to have a chance for one round of introductions where we each say who we are and what's the area we're working on, or on campus, or just maybe in addition to your name, maybe 2 sentences, so we have a sense of who's here today. James.
Hi, I'm James. I work for the George L. Mufti program in history. I'm an intellectual historian, but I do mostly work on history of science and religion.
I'm Eric Carlson. I'm a lecturer in the history department and the religious studies program. I work on, particularly in Germany in the 18th century, the German Enlightenment and theology in the 18th century.
David Hildner. In Spanish and Portuguese, I work mostly on 16th and 17th century of Spain, including Spanish mysticism.
I'm Ben Shannon. I just finished my PhD in the history program. I work on Christian Marxist dialogue in West Germany in the 1960s.
My name is Fred Klates. I am actually a visiting scholar here. I'm being hosted by the Department of Anthropology. I'm based at the Department of Anthropology at SUNY Buffalo, and I'm working on a book that's taking a comparative look at majority white and African American Pentecostal congregations in Buffalo.
I'm David Schultz. I have a master's in theology. I work for the center here, and I'm happy to be along for the ride.
I'm Dan Hummel. I work at Upper House, a Christian Studies Center just across the street. Got my PhD here in history in 2016, and I work on American religious history.
Ulrich Rosenhagen, running the center, working on interreligious dialogue, and if I don't finally start writing the biography on Rudolf Otto I planned for a long time, I think my wife is going to file for divorce.
I'm Samita Senamai. I'm a third-year PhD student in the English department, literary studies. I work on the South Asian model and specifically Buddhist modernism in Sri Lanka.
My name is Samina Hussain. I'm from the sociology department. I'm a PhD student there. And right now my work is basically on faith-based organizations and social service.
I'm Karen Trevino. I was the administrator of the Regards to Chuck, and I'm currently Goalie, the administrator of this center.
I'm Catherine Bowie. I'm in the anthropology department. I work on, Theravada Buddhism, and written on a famous folktale, Buddhist folktale that I used to hate, but now I love, and I'm sorry that it's disappearing. And right now I'm writing about a Buddhist monk who was arrested in 1920 and 1936, and 300, 2,000 of his followers were forcibly disrobed by police, trying to figure out what was going on.
My name is Megan Stanton. I am a lecturer in the history department where I finished my PhD a little over a year ago. I work in American religion and kinship, including 19th century Mormonism.
My name is John Dunn. I'm in the Center for Healthy Minds and also in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and have an affiliation with Religious Studies, and actually was here 99 to 2005 before I got recruited by Emory for 10 years and worked with Chuck a lot on the Religious Studies program back then. I work a lot on Buddhism sort of in general, but especially Buddhist philosophy and theory of meditation practices, and I also do empirical research on meditation practices like mindfulness.
Hi, I'm Mo. I'm a historian in the history department. I work on South Asia, specifically on conversion to Christianity from Islam and Hinduism in the 19th century.
My name is Joshua Tan. I'm a graduate student in history, and I'm working on 20th century Chinese migration and how Chinese migrants made use of missionary networks across the British Empire.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see this kind of variety and this kind of flourishing in study of religion as an intellectual discipline.
Okay, and with that, I open it up. There is no particular order. And maybe to start us off, your foundational metaphor of braided histories. Can you kind of flesh this out a little bit? I mean, it's very obvious metaphor. I know what braided means.
Well, I guess it's obvious, though I haven't run across it much before. And again, I think the point is, how do you tell this kind of story in some way? If we're talking about method, one of the questions really sinks me, and it's something to chew on for this, has to do with, did I have any theoretical background? For this, no. Or I've gone back to the historian's basics of narrative, of trying to tell a story, knowing, of course, that there are huge gaps. I mean, obviously there's much more that I didn't say than I could possibly say. But the notion of a braid, and going back to the course that grounds this, is how do you make sense? What kind of framework do you use? I suppose suddenly it occurs to me that someone of a greater scientific bent than I might have thought of a helix, or maybe it's a triple helix for those so inclined. But for me, a braid just felt sort of metaphorically right as a way of both conveying the separateness of traditions and their interrelationship, and maybe also a little bit as a device to help construct a narrative. Because how do you, how do you tell a story like this? I mean, we can imagine, for instance, telling an entire story about Judaism and then going back and telling it about Christianity and going back and telling it about Islam. I think that would have been dreadful, but it's an option, and it has a certain simplicity that might commend it. So I think braiding for me, besides the fact that I like the way it sounds, it is poetic, damn it, and I had gotten to keep it. It is gets to the guts of the process that I had to construct in order to make this if this makes any sense at all. How did I keep it cogent?
One of the things that I like about that metaphor is that it, the strands are certainly separate, but if the braid falls apart, the strands fall apart. Right? When you braid your hair, the strands are what's holding it all together. So if they fall apart, then there's no more strand. They lose their individual identity. Is that part of what you're trying to evoke? In a sense
I like that. Sure. Thanks, John. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I'm happy to claim it.
Because that seems to me that you could definitely make that argument that in a sense, I mean, quite obviously because of Christianity wouldn't be Christianity or Judaism, but modern Judaism, or even Rabbinic Judaism wouldn't be Rabbinic Judaism without Christianity, you would say.
And yes, I mean, which is exactly the point that I'm trying to evoke. Again, for people like you who are professional students of religion, these are probably easily won truths and places where you start from. But again, for a general audience, and that's really what this series is designed for, and the kinds of people I wanted to attract. One of my mentors once said the most important thing you can do is to note the obvious, or don't overlook the obvious because it needs to be said. So in one sense, that's what I'm trying to do, but I also had to find the narrative or the framework in which to make that cogent. And I think in putting this together, aside from having to learn all of this, because one disclaimer, as some of you will know, I didn't start out in this. I was hired here to do 17th and 18th century Anglo-America, and slowly migrated to American religious history, but kept my courses in early America. And so this is a late stage of life development, as I like to say. If I had known in graduate school where I was headed, I would have studied Arabic, but I didn't need it for 17th century New England. Which I guess is to say, at least to those of you who are starting out, all sorts of exciting vistas might be open to you, and that you have no clue. And that's exciting, and maybe you should study Arabic now, or something else. Yeah.
Going back to the braid, Chuck, as someone who has braided her own hair before I cut it all off, it requires a particular kind of intention on the part of the person who's doing the braiding, but also there is a particular kind of entanglement that happens. Your hair will snare if you don't brush it out very well. Mm-hmm. So your braiding, is this a thing that you as a historian are doing, or do you see the histories themselves braided clearly? Because there is a symmetry that is being assumed here, which to me is both something to aspire to, but the messiness of the lived history and the entanglements are not quite commensurate with the idea of what we think of when we see a braid. I was just wondering what you would...
Well, as someone who's never braided his own hair, or anyone else's, I lack that tactile sense that you enjoy. I hope there's messiness in the details. Clearly, in trying to be, I keep saying cogent, but also maybe coherent. There are ways in which I have to keep the braids distinct, just so that one can follow along. I say for me this chapter, chapter 3, where I'm jumping from Rabbinic Judaism to Imperial Roman politics to the splits between the Eastern and Western churches to Christological and Trinitarian theories to Jewish-Christian relations. all have to be in that time period, and they all will make sense in context of each other, but I have to tell them serially. And so there's a certain neatness, I think, that I have to impose on the story lest it all fall apart and a reader be completely confused. My hope is that there's enough messiness maybe within each of those sections that some of what you refer to as entanglement gets through. And I suppose, like someone braiding, there's artistry to braiding, or at least I imagined, knowing that I wouldn't have a clue. There is, I think, a certain artistry that's required in getting that sense across. Those differing senses, if you
Yes. Well, first of all, I wanted to offer congratulations on being able to put all this immensely rich and complex material into such a concise form. It's quite an accomplishment. I wonder if I could ask you, though, to reflect a little further on what you see as the place of this concept of the Abrahamic traditions in contemporary political discourses. I certainly see how it's a step in the right direction against or a way to combat various right-wing tendencies in the American academic scene, to impose Western civilization curricula on universities, which are obviously anti-Muslim in their intent. I do wonder if there might be some risk in framing tradition as a guide to narrative, as I think you put it earlier. Because I think that one could talk about braided histories of, say, Hindu-Muslim or Buddhist-Muslim relations in South or Southeast Asia. Those are arguably, these are not religious traditions that come from the same source in any obvious way, but they're certainly intertwined relations with a very rich history in particular parts of the world. And I'm wondering, to what extent, by framing things in terms of the Abrahamic traditions, one risks the kind of move of separating out civilizations again. Do you know what I mean?
Nicely put. And I think I would agree with everything you said. I don't have a patent on the phrase braided traditions. Nor would I say these are the only traditions that can be braided. I think in the list of questions that Uli sent me, one of them pretty much anticipated yours. I would encourage someone who can do that kind of work for other traditions, absolutely. I know my limits, it won't be me. But I'm not isolating or saying these are the only, these three traditions are the only traditions that can be braided. I think there is a particularly rich history that one can use that is the stuff that I was able to work. I didn't invent the history. I just tried to tell, find a good way of telling it. And you're certainly right. I mean, about the political implications that I mentioned at the end of the talk. Does it run? There may be a risk of reifying these into an Abrahamic civilization. I would make the argument that there's such a thing as an Abrahamic civilization. I'm not sure I would know what that is. I would say that in many places, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in some way, shape, and form, and some with their measures being different in different places, have had a lot of interaction. But no, I don't think I've ever claimed that there's something called an Abrahamic civilization, and if I did, then that's on me, because I wouldn't have a clue how to define it. So I like the term as a way of talking about these particular traditions, but I wouldn't want to reify it into a thing in itself and then declare it, here they are. I gave a talk to the Madison Baha'i community on Sunday, and of course had to start out by apologizing. I said, well, there are 2 sentences about the Baha'is in the book, and I dutifully told them where so that they wouldn't stone me, not that Baha'is would stone anyone. During the Institute's days, there was one particular Baha'i who would sort of chide me, why aren't you bringing Baha'is into this story more? So I don't intend for these membranes to be impermeable. But again, I think trying to grasp what I see as the historical reality, and at the end to make a few quick polemical, if you will, points that I really want to make, I think this is an effective way to make them. And that's all that I want to do.
I have a question about sources of inspiration. I remember there was a book by F.E. Peters, came out a little while ago, titled Children of Abraham. I don't know if you've heard of it. And I think he focused more on theological continuities and discontinuities between the Abrahamic tradition, and wondering if how you would define your approach differently from maybe what Peters has done in his work.
Well, I once tried to get F.E. Peters here. The list, I have many people I tried to bring for the Institute who didn't come. And in his case, well, he said he was 80 and he didn't travel beyond Manhattan very much anymore.
And you didn't email, if I remember that.
That's a different list. And I said, I think this survived in the acknowledgments that trying to write about this spread of material can't be done by anyone, though F.E. Peters probably comes closer than anyone else. So I have great admiration, and I learned a great deal. I think one of the differences, he takes something of a historical approach, though, say, it's not as systematic as, in some ways it's more thematic in certain ways than what I've done. He covers different kinds of material than I do. And he also stops at about 1500. Indeed, his 3 volumes of primary sources, which I found invaluable, and then they got all cut out anyway in the editing, in the word count, stops in 1500. So he sort of doesn't, and it's a fair point, doesn't try to deal with the changes of the last 500 years. So, in other words, in one kind of vocabulary, he's writing about pre-industrial or, quote, traditional, or however we want to put it, societies before the change, before modernity. But as I say, I have tremendous respect for his learning, which is far, far greater than mine. and learned a great deal from his particular, whatever subject he was writing. Yeah.
So 2 questions. The first is on your sort of second takeaway about politics matters. I wonder if you could talk a little more about if you see any role that the creation of the State of Israel has played in actually changing Judaism. Like if we're going to say that sort of the political conditions really shape the religious communities, is there, I'm thinking, the major Christian turning point would be Constantine declaring, or at least Constantine declaring Christianity not illegal. I know it's early in the story for the State of Israel. I guess we only have 70 years or something. But do you see that the creation of the State of Israel as all in reshaping Judaism? And then the second question is, I know you struggled very mightily to get this down to 35,000 words. Mm-hmm. If you were gifted from some deity from Abraham's God, 5,000 more words, another chapter basically, like what would be that chapter that you'd add?
So that's an invitation to tell my story. So, but the first, well, it's certain, Israel has certainly changed some Christianity. Someone has written about Christian Zionism.
Sure.
And the ways in which the instantiation of the State of Israel has changed the way Christians think. My thinking about Judaism or about Jews is that it's just made us angrier at each other, which is, but it doesn't start that. I think a sort of very global sweep on Judaism would be that at the time of the Second Temple, Judaism is fractured or displays, it's either fractured or, in a more optimistic way, it displays great variety. And there's no single Judaism. As Jews move, as rabbinic Judaism develops over 500-600 years, begins to take hold, what characterizes Jewish difference, it's certainly ways of interpretation of halacha, the law, ways of living the tradition on the ground, all sorts of ways. But Jews don't, unlike Christians, don't develop a conception of heresy and of beating each other about the ears because of these differences until fairly recently. And so what happens, I think, in Judaism, or to Jews, as a result of the Enlightenment and modern times, is that reform results in Reform Judaism, which, if there's one original thought in the book, it's that Reform Judaism, which happens to be my own tradition, and this just struck me, I wasn't thinking this until I thought it, is maybe the most radical reform movement in the sense of actually declaring that one of its founding scriptures, in this case the Talmud, or if you will, desacralizing its scriptures. That's not a move, obviously, that Muslims make with the Quran, and it's not a move that Protestants make with the Bible. But Reformed Jews do that. And that's so upsetting that suddenly other Jews have to define themselves as Orthodox. I mean, there is no Orthodox Judaism until there's a Reformed Judaism. And then you have to get a middle ground, which is conservative Judaism, and then you start getting off Judaism. So that Judaism these days is as fractured as it was, in a certain way, as it was 2,000 years ago. Now, theologically, I don't know. To my mind, the more sort of pregnant theological moment for Jews is the Holocaust. At least in my own thinking. But I think it's going to take centuries for that to work itself out. In a way, and I'll put this as a temporary. I'll throw this out, and then the internet will get a hold of it, and I'm done. That Israel is more important as a political, the re-realization of Jewish power in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land, which Jews hadn't ruled since the Hasmoneans, before Rome takes over. Now, does this mean, there are movements, or at least some people think, well, now it's time to build the third temple, and so on. But I think that the greater theological speculation involves the Holocaust. And, which is, if you will, even worse than the Assyrians. I mean, they posed a theological question, but the Holocaust has led certain Jewish thinkers to say, well, God left us, so maybe it's time for us to leave God, so let's go study the Talmud, because that's what we do. Okay, so I think that's the moment. The other question about if I had 5,000 words, well, I actually wrote the first draft of this at about 50,000. And that included footnotes, and I did it because I wanted, I had this feeling that every sentence I wrote crossed a field that someone had spent his or her whole life on. And so I can't possibly be right, I can only be less wrong. And so I wanted to be as less wrong as I could possibly be. So I wrote it out more, and I was also trying to figure out, because I have these other books in the series, there are 600 of these. The book is as large as it is because there's lots of advertising for all 600 of them in the front, or at least there's a list of them. Needless to say, that wasn't my choice either. And so I wrote the first draft to make sure that I could get as much in, and that I could feel as sort of safe as I could. Now, the original last chapter was actually a thematic chapter that I thought led up to some of the conclusions that I still have. But it was a chapter that dealt with conceptions of time, and this sacred cycles, so the ritual calendars in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, with mysticism, and now all of a sudden I'm, of course, blanking on what the third issue was. But that chapter got, the third one was talking about how the different traditions interpret Abraham, and what Abraham really means for both of them, and how that leads to certain kinds of conflict, or can lead to certain kinds of conflicts. Early on, when it was sent out to the blind readers, some of them had questions about that chapter, so it got reduced. And then, of course, I had to bring the whole thing into scale, and so and now here's the story. So I send off this the manuscript with this reduced last chapter, and for 9 months, my editors have said, they've wanted me to tell them, is there a time when you won't be reachable? And I say, yes. Late April, early May, we're going to Morocco. We get in Casablanca. I have, for better or worse, taken my tablet with me. I get an email. You're over the word limit. We need production. We're going into production right now. You have to cut 2,000 words. now. And when I say I told you I was going to be away, the answer comes back, it's your fault. It's too long. So, somehow, because I do not write quickly and I don't edit quickly, but I wanted to see the house on the second mosque. And so, in an afternoon, in a hotel in Casablanca, I cut 2,000 words from chapter, and it was all going to be from chapter 8. If I had started to cut 20 words from chapter 1 and 200 from chapter 2, I'd still be there. And we had a reservation for one night. So 2,000 words from chapter 8, which becomes now an epilogue. Although it then, I get to assert things without having to develop or prove them. There's a certain advantage in it. So I think if I had 5,000 words back, I would want to put some of them back in that last chapter. There are other things that I would want to, I don't know if you can say flesh out. I mean, because flesh actually suggests fat and more words than I'd be allowed. But there would be a couple of things. Christology. For some reason, I have this abiding love of trying to think about Christology. And when I would teach the course and we'd get to, I was always excited when we'd get to that lecture, and I would study, and I was sure I had the Trinity down, finally. And then each time this class came, it faded away. So I would like to have said a little more about the hoops that Christians jumped through in order to get to where they got to. But that's just something for me. Yeah, Catherine.
I was intrigued by your comment that the Muslim societies tended to treat their minority, Jews and Christians, better than the Christian societies treated their religious minorities. And so, as I was listening to your talk, and I was responding very much as Fred was, like, wait a minute, where are my people? And having just reread Brodel, The Mediterranean, I was seeing flows of people, and I love the braided history idea. So I just like it. So what are you, on the Muslim end of the world, were they looking more towards other religions that are not included on the Mediterranean end? Would that, so to speculate on why?
So I will admit that, the book is weaker on the East, whatever the East means. There's a book in this series Adam Silverstein wrote on Islamic history, and a book that I've looked at a lot. And he suggests that up to 1500, that very important date, there's a kind of unified Islamic history, and after that there isn't. And that, you will sort of get that impression. I don't take that up, but I think that's underlying what I'm saying a little bit. So as a result, I say I'm woefully ignorant of your part of the world. And I think in chapter 7, I hope I got Islam. I think I got Islam to Southeast Asia in one sentence. And there you are. Done. Well, I got Christianity to Australia in a sentence too, so them's the breaks. But as for relationships to the East, the term people of the book, which comes to be used, at least colloquially, to mean Jews, Christians, and Muslims, of course, is a term from the Quran and refers to Jews and Christians. And it becomes pliable. Some Muslims incorporate Hindus who don't, in my knowledge of that tradition, are not the most monotheistic people in the world but they get included as well. So there is some fungibility, which is again something I'm trying to say throughout. But and someone, you know, like Andre Vink will have, you know, who's a colleague, but whose work I can't say that I have begun to ingest in any way, shape, or form, even though his office was next to mine for a while, you know, would be the place or a place where you would see all of this mixing and so on, I think, in all its full glory. But he got 5 volumes. And he has every language around the Indian Ocean, so he has certain advantages.
Quick question. You talk about jihad as an ideology evolving as a response to the Crusades. In what way do you see that change, both those terms, jihad and crusade, in the 19th century, when you talk about Islam feeling the pressure of Christianity pressing in through the means of colonialism?
Well, I think, I do talk about jihad earlier, I didn't mention it here, but and jihad, of course, it is a complicated concept that refers both to the greater jihad, that is one's innermost struggles, and the lesser jihad. My editor once asked, isn't it the other way around? And I said, no, but take it up with the ulama, with the religious scholars. They put it that way. In my understanding, crusade, well, jihad is a very precise legal term that over centuries, I think, gets opened up. One of the issues is who can call for it. And originally it's supposed to, as you know better than I, it's the caliph. And so that it's a very, very regulated term. Only the caliph, who is the guardian of Islam, can invoke this principle. And over centuries, that gets argued down. So I think, if I have it right, one of the legal responses to the intrusion of the Crusades is in rethinking jihad and who can call it. And there's a greater, I'll use the word, and maybe advisedly, democratization of it, so that it's not only the caliph who can call it, others can. By the time we get to the present, I mean, ISIS is and groups like that are invoking concepts that anyone can call. That it's in the legal texts, but who gets to call it? In a way, it's structurally similar to what happens in Protestantism about who can interpret Scripture. And most 16th century Protestants want to hedge that around. They don't want to turn Scripture open just to anybody. But sure enough, you know, folks come along who do that. And so much depends on interpretation. I am not so much a student of holy war theory. I think after, my sense is that it becomes less important as a legal category for Christian expansion in the 19th century in formal ways, in the way that it was in the 11th and 12th, when the Pope is reversing the whole penitential system and saying that, it used to be that that warriors came home from battle and had to do penance. Now, if they go to battle, that's penitential. I don't see that, though my ignorance is deep, happening in the 19th century. Crusade comes to mean, I think, in the vernacular to be strongly held beliefs in doing something that in which God is said to be the animating party. And so we have crusades for lots of things. So my sense is that it loses that kind of specific legal nexus.
Yeah.
We could stop.
I want to be
Yeah.
mindful of
Yeah.
everyone's time, including myself. I have a son who's playing soccer right now, and who needs to get picked up.
For Bayern Munich, right?
I hope not. Never. He won't be my son anymore if he dares to invoke the Bayern. Thank you so much, Chuck, for your comments, your thoughts, your talk, your answers. This was really enjoyable, and I think everyone will join me in another round of applause.
I really appreciate seeing some old friends whom I have not seen in some time.
Please.